Hi, folks, and welcome to week 6 on the residential schools and the Indian problem. As usual, we have our weekly set of learning objectives. Let's dive in. All right, before we pick up where we left off last week, let's start with some historical precursors to the assimilation policy of the late 19th century. We can actually go all the way back to the Spanish colonization of the Americas and the lasting influence of Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a conquistador before becoming a Dominican friar, the Bishop of Chiapas, Mexico, and the protector of the Indians. So he returned to Spain to participate in the 1550 Valladolid debate, which was convened by Spanish King Charles V, who had taken the unprecedented step of suspending all further conquest in the Americas until the morality of Spanish colonial rule could be justified. The debate was between Las Casas and a humanist philosopher who argued that indiscriminate warfare could be waged against the Indians in order to make way for Christianity, because the Indians were nothing more than wild beasts who had provoked God's wrath by violating natural law. In contrast, Las Casas maintained that the Indians were still humans who had been made in the image and likeness of God. His conviction that the entire human race is one was definitely a step in the right direction, at least when the terms of the debate were over whether or not indigenous peoples are in fact fully human. Even so, Las Casas was still operating under the dominant assumption that Indians were inferior to Europeans, and both he and his interlocutor shared the conviction that the ultimate goal was to spread Christianity. To the extent that Las Casas respected indigenous cultures, it was only a means to this end. Indeed, kind of like we saw last week, the issue was over means, not ends. For Las Casas, it was persuasive violence, his words, rather than physical violence. But those were the options, even for Las Casas. The Indians could either convert and be swallowed up by the grace of Christendom, or be expelled altogether and face extermination as if they were the spawn of Satan. This impossible choice between genocide and ethnocide will be a theme of the week. Anyways, Las Casas' work was quickly translated and reviewed in English, and his ideas even influenced the New England Puritans a century later, who embarked upon an ambitious but ultimately unsuccessful effort to convert the Indians. Indeed, the English royal charter that formally incorporated the joint stock company for the colonization of Massachusetts Bay included a provision for converting the Indians. Here you even see the official seal of the colony, which shows an Indian holding an upside-down arrow as a gesture of peace, saying, quote, "Come over and help us." Missionary work commenced in the 1640s, only after wars against the Pequot and the Narragansetts had secured the frontier for settlement. Beginning in the 1650s, Puritan missionaries established so-called praying towns for some of the smaller tribes along the seaboard who had already been devastated by epidemics and had become economically dependent upon the English. Kind of like the Spanish mission system, these small villages of Indians were each led by a white missionary who provided instruction for religious conversion as well as for adopting white customs. But assimilation was never a real possibility, and most English colonists opposed the praying towns because they coveted Indian lands and because they harbored deep-seated prejudicial fears of quote-unquote savages, even Christian ones. Ultimately, few praying towns remained after the King Philip's War devastated the tribes of New England. The impossible choice between genocide and ethnocide framed American Indian policy during the early Republic. In week 3, we noted that the preferred policy option was to obtain land cessions from Indians that were ostensibly consensual, albeit backed by the very real, not at all empty threat of extirpative warfare as a Plan B, to use Osler's words. Once the threat of an intertribal confederacy in the Old Northwest had been neutralized, we saw in week 4 how the first administration of George Washington adopted what it saw as an economically cost-effective and geopolitically prudent means of securing the frontier through the so-called civilization policy. The plan was based on the highly paternalistic and Eurocentric assumption that if Indians simply abandoned their cultures and learned how to practice agriculture and land ownership according to Euro-American laws and norms, then they could be assimilated into U.S. society. So if the Indians simply stopped being Indians and became Americans, then problem solved. At least that was the idea. But this assumption was also very idealistic in the sense of being detached from reality. For one thing, indigenous peoples directed their own form and pace of cultural change, and a wholesale abandonment of indigenous cultures was never realistic. Likewise, much like the praying towns a century and a half prior, even assimilated Indians had no real place in American society. Thomas Jefferson realized this dilemma. He admired what he saw as noble savages and wanted to assimilate them into white society by getting them to adopt Euro-American customs and practice agriculture in small tracts of land. Although, if you go to this part of Osler's textbook from week 4, Jefferson was also resigned to the structural impossibility of assimilating the Indians. Thus, removal was conceived as an alternative policy premised upon the presumed failure of assimilation to transcend the boundary between savagery and civilization. According to proponents of removal, native peoples were ostensibly incapable of keeping up in the modern world, and despite the enticements of assimilation, they remained an obstacle to expansion. Coexistence was impossible, moreover, because they were deemed to be implacable. Now it's clear to us that the Indians didn't want to have their lands stolen, and that they were entirely capable of charting their own path through modernity. Not that any of that mattered to proponents of removal, who remained deeply committed to the tenets of extinction discourse, despite all evidence to the contrary. And although we may be inclined to see right through their humanitarian pretense for removal, at least some proponents genuinely believed it to be a good plan. Claudio Sant's book thus opens with this white Baptist missionary who envisioned creating an Indian Canaan west of the Mississippi River in order to save these sheep, as he imagined the Indians to be, from the slaughter of Americans. Yet, rather than face total extermination, as he put it, the scheme of transplanting the Indians could achieve some sort of, quote, national salvation, which only made sense when built upon the self-serving myth of the vanishing Indian. As we saw in week 4, however, the humanitarian pretense for removal obscured other, more self-serving material and ideological motivations. But the point here is that the removal policy was essentially one of segregation and expulsion. Indians could remain Indians, but only if they did so somewhere else. And that is the opposite of assimilation and integration. In that sense, the idea of removal wasn't all that dissimilar from the contemporaneous scheme to send freed blacks to colonize Africa, thereby potentially enabling the U.S. to divest itself of a particular group of people that upset the racial order of white supremacy. Of course, such schemes were illusory, as settler expansion rapidly closed in on Indian territory from all directions, leaving nowhere left for removal. Thus, I argued last week that reservations were like metaphorical doors that brought in formerly independent indigenous peoples from the exterior to the interior of the U.S. body politic, a shift that was most perceptible with the administrative transfer of the BIA from the War Department to the Interior Department in 1849. 2 years later, the Secretary of the Interior bluntly assessed this crucial shift, stating that, quote, the policy of removal must necessarily be abandoned, and the only alternatives left are to civilize or exterminate them. Restated in our contemporary vernacular, the impossible choice here was, once again, between ethnocide or genocide. Yet, despite this apparent shift in Indian policy, there was still an underlying continuity in terms of the logic of elimination, especially with the widespread normalization of extinction discourse across the English-speaking world and beyond. The operating assumption was more or less the total cultural erasure of indigenous peoples as the price to pay for progress. Otherwise, they were supposedly doomed, at least according to this increasingly racist logic. On this view, in the words of Stuart Banner, Indian treaties were a vestige of a time when tribes were much like foreign states. Treaties are outwards, or exterior-facing protocols of international relations, the orientation of which was at odds with the push to domesticate and assimilate the Indians into the American body politic. This was the logic behind Congress's decision in 1871 to end formal treaty making with Indians. The descriptive language you see here unwittingly gestures to this shift to interiority, as formerly independent people were swallowed into the settler colonial polity. Yet, as we saw last week as well, the reservations policy was an instigator of the post-1865 Indian Wars on the Great Plains, thereby precipitating a political debate in American settler society over how best to solve the so-called Indian problem, a debate that put the reservations policy at cross purposes with itself. On the one hand, the highly idealistic and openly stated purpose of the reservations was to establish places for assimilation, providing a compact space where the Indians could be more easily instructed in Christianity, agriculture, and all the other essential features of quote-unquote civilization. On the other hand, the dominant political realist logic of the time used reservations as biopolitical tools to securitize the West. Especially after the Civil War, reservations became de facto internal colonies, with federal troops responsible for maintaining order and preventing violence from spilling beyond the reservations. There were a number of incidents in the late 1870s of Indians breaking out of their assigned reservations in order to return to their homelands, resulting in the Army essentially hunting them down like escaped convicts. Perhaps the most high-profile incident was in 1879, when Standing Bear, a chief of the Ponca tribe, was arrested trying to break out of his federally assigned reservation in Indian Territory in order to repatriate the remains of his dead son to their original homeland, in what by then had become the state of Nebraska. Reform-minded citizens in Omaha, Nebraska, turned Standing Bear into a minor cause célèbre, publicly promoting his story and successfully advocating for him in the American legal system. Incidents like this called into question the purpose of the reservations, at least for a growing reform movement of East Coast humanitarians. For example, in 1879, two middle-class women from a well-to-do Baptist church in Philadelphia founded the Women's National Indian Association. Helen Hunt Jackson's book that we read in Week 3, A Century of Dishonor, was published in 1881, and in 1883, the Indian Rights Association was founded, also in Philadelphia, by philanthropists and humanitarians who garnered increased political clout over the following decade. Now, don't let the names of these groups fool you, like the so-called Friends of the Indian. What they referred to as, quote, Indian rights is different from what we think of as Indian rights, the contemporary meaning of which was shaped in the post-1970s context of Native American activism. Anyways, these so-called Friends of the Indians may have been liberal humanitarians, but their attitudes and assumptions still nevertheless reflected broader power dynamics during the Gilded Age in American history. It's no accident that the push to assimilate the Indians came at a time when, for example, mass immigration necessitated a similar shift in managing the cultural differences between immigrant outgroups and the core settler in-group. Prior to the Civil War, the cultural differences of non-English European immigrant outgroups was tolerated to a degree by the settler American in-group, defined by the white Anglo-Saxon core identity. But after the Civil War, the influx of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe necessitated a means for incorporating these outsiders at an industrial scale, turning many into one. That's the motto of the United States, by the way, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. Now, our contemporary sensibilities may see the history of American immigration through the metaphor of the melting pot, whereby cultural differences blend to produce something altogether new. But in the historical context of the late 19th century, assimilation was supposed to be a one-way street, with the entire process directed towards the normative standards of the dominant in-group. From that hegemonic perspective, if an immigrant or an Indian wanted to be an American, then they had to leave their traditional cultures behind and totally assimilate into modern society, as per the self-defined rules of the core settler identity. Assimilation into the American mainstream was thus like a giant metaphoric escalator that lifted up individuals from lowly outgroups and promised upward social mobility. The price to pay for admission into modern society, however, required leaving behind traditional identities to be replaced by an American one. Now, this old idea of assimilation may be seen in the same light as cultural genocide, but in this late 19th century context, such an idea was actually quite progressive and liberal in a classical sense of the term. This was the intellectual historical context of the 1887 General Allotment Act, otherwise known as the Dawes Act, named after its author, Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts. In hindsight, we know how destructive this legislation was, in terms of deracinating the Indians and severing them from their lands. That was quite the purpose, as we'll see. But much like Las Casas, centuries earlier, was just the humanitarian face of empire, the Dawes Act was intended to be a progressive alternative to the failed reservations policy. Different means, same end. In fact, John Locke was a major philosophical influence on the conceptual foundation of the allotment policy. Recall how the Lockean labor theory of property was used by the Supreme Court in the removal era to undermine indigenous ownership claims. The same ideological reasoning was used to break up the reservations and impose upon Native Americans the ethical principle of possessive individualism, the idea being that by learning how to work the land individually and achieve self-sufficiency in the modern market economy, Indians could start moving up the metaphorical escalator of the American social system. Now, the way the Allotment Act was supposed to work was that 160 acres of land would be granted to each Indian household, leaving behind enormous portions of reservations that were then sold by the government to white settlers, with the proceeds used to benefit the Indians, at least in theory. The allotments provided a fee patent title on the land that was supposed to be held in trust by the federal government for 25 years, at which point the allottees were free to sell or lease to whomever. The act also promised the right of citizenship for those deemed to have been quote-unquote civilized. A little over a decade after the Dawes Act passed, President Theodore Roosevelt's first annual message to Congress captured the essence of the policy. In my judgment, he said, the time has arrived when we should definitely make up our minds to recognize the Indian as an individual and not as a member of a tribe. The General Allotment Act is a mighty pulverizing engine to break up the tribal mass. It acts directly upon the family and the individual. The Indian should be treated as an individual, like the white man. So allotment was just another policy designed to solve the so-called Indian problem. Again, new means, same end. Like removal, it detached Indians from their land, enabling the U.S. government to extinguish tribal title. Stuart Banner goes on to illustrate how the actual implementation of the allotment policy was beset by poor government management and settler colonial pressures from local whites eager to swoop in on the newly opened real estate. This resulted in large-scale dispossession, as well as the checkerboard pattern of land ownership that has broken up reservations into scattered, island-like jurisdictions cast out in the larger sea of settler sovereignty. So, the liberal idealism of allotment may have been inspired by so called civilization, but like pretty much everything else in the history of American Indian policy, it all comes back to the land. Different means, same end. Speaking of which, compulsory schooling as a form of social control was a complementary technique in the new push to domesticate the Indians. Again, we have to set this against a broader historical background. The late 19th century was the heyday of modernity, which, among other things, involved the development of mass education in Western Europe and the Americas, where it played a crucial role in integrating the nation-state. Sociologists use the concept of socialization to refer to how people acquire a sense of self and social identity and learn about the social groups to which they belong and do not belong. This was how diversity was managed in the late 19th century, with public schools teaching impressionable children how to become members of society, including something as basic as learning a common language, as well as learning the repertoire of stories and taken for granted truth claims that constitute what we've been identifying as sedimented knowledge. Ideally, public education systems were designed to promote civic values and inculcate responsible citizenship, as well as to teach skills that would enhance the nation's economic productivity. Yet this leaned into another, more or less unspoken purpose of public schooling, the origins and expansion of which was an elite-driven process that, in principle, helped consolidate the power of a central authority by commanding the discipline, obedience, and respect of students. State-regulated primary education systems were thus conceived as an important component of state-building agendas designed to promote social order, especially in societies experiencing internal conflict and mass violence, where compulsory education was imagined as an alternative to repression, although really it was just a more cost-efficient and quote-unquote civilized means to the same end. This was the broader context in which Richard Henry Pratt founded the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Revealingly, Battlefield and Classroom was the title of his autobiography, which perfectly illustrates the state-led and discipline-oriented form of education that epitomized public schooling at the time, not to mention the apparent shift in Indian policy from an externally oriented war footing to an inward-oriented process of domestication and assimilation. Pratt's career in the U.S. Army tracks with this shift. Originally enlisted for the Civil War, he then served on the Great Plains during the Indian Wars. His final assignment in the military was to escort 72 Kiowa, Comanche, and Cheyenne prisoners of war to Fort Marion in sunny St. Augustine, Florida, where they became tourist attractions due to Pratt's practice of hiring out the prisoners to local employers. In fact, there was a prominent Indian rights advocate who was vacationing there at the time who was deeply impressed with Pratt's experimental attempt to, quote-unquote, tame the Indians through education, labor, and discipline. With new, well-connected contacts such as this, Pratt was able to get his charges initially enlisted at the Hampton Institute in Virginia, which was established after the Civil War to provide education for freed blacks, although apparently differing attitudes towards race and racism led Pratt to petition the government to establish his own boarding school, specifically for Indians. Thus, in 1879, the War Department authorized Pratt's request to open an Indian boarding school at an unused Army barracks near Carlisle, Pennsylvania. But first, some deeper history in Carlisle, which actually has a much longer legacy of anti-Indian violence. This was actually the ancestral home of the Susquehannock people, whom we briefly met in Week 3. In the 17th century, Iroquoian attacks during the Beaver Wars pushed them further south to the Chesapeake, which brought them into conflict with white settlers in Virginia, thereby pushing them back north to the original homelands by the early 18th century. By then, the human geography of the region was in flux, with groups of Shawnees, Lenapes, Nanticokes, Tuscaroras, and others, in addition to the Susquehannocks, populating numerous multi-ethnic villages, just as an influx of Scotch-Irish settlers began migrating to the Pennsylvania backcountry. Carlisle began as a trading post in this context, turning into a town that became a gateway for Anglo-American settlers moving into the frontier. The town also became a hotbed for the anti-Indianism that precipitated the 1763 Conestoga Massacre, which is what effectively extinguished the Susquehanna as an independent people. During the Revolutionary War, and turned into a military barrack. In 1830s, the barracks were turned into a training facility for the U.S. Army's cavalry, and during the Civil War, Confederate forces raided the barracks. So when Pratt took over the facility, it was dilapidated and in desperate need of repair. Significant renovations and additions were made, funded in part from a congressional appropriations known as the, quote, Civilization Fund, which had been sourced from the sale of allotted Osage land in Kansas. Yet much of the funding came from private donations from local Quakers, as well as a charity created by Pratt called the Friends of Carlisle. Additionally, the school's upkeep depended upon student labor, who took care of the cooking, cleaning, laundry, and repair work. A total of 7,711 students attended Carlisle during its years of operation from 1879 to 1918. They came from 118 different tribes across the continental US, as well as 59 Puerto Ricans and one Filipino. Now, of that total, only 758 students actually graduated, comprising less than a measly 10% graduation rate. Thus, in retrospect, we can clearly see the school as a failure, even by the own standards of the administrators. The curriculum was designed to totally immerse students in a disciplinary environment, half a day for academics, the other half for work. Students were, as a rule, not permitted any free time, with time not spent for work or studies to be spent in mandatory, closely supervised extracurricular activities. Now, before we can examine the influential role of Carlisle in inspiring the establishment of the Canadian Indian residential school system, first, a brief political history is necessary. So the British took over Canada after the French and Indian War, and in 1841, the Crown united Upper and Lower Canada into a single British colony known as the Province of Canada. Now, prior to that period, relations between Indians and Europeans in Canada revolved around the fur trade and military alliances. Yet the end of the fur trade operations out of Montreal diminished commercial relations between Indians and Europeans, just as peace between the United States and Great Britain lessened the need for indigenous military alliances. Meanwhile, an influx of immigrants, including loyalists from the US, but mostly from Britain and Ireland, changed the demography of the colony. With these changing circumstances, indigenous peoples became perceived obstacles to expansion. Thus, very much like the US in a general sense, Canadian Indian policy shifted from an exterior relationship based on diplomacy to an interior one based on civilian administration. This shift was evident with the Bagot Commission, named after the Governor-General of the Province of Canada, who convened this royal commission to study government policies and expenditures regarding the Indians. It recommended that Indians be encouraged to adopt individual ownership of plots of land, much like the allotment policy granting fee simple private property rights. Additionally, the Commission proposed the establishment of off-reservation boarding schools to teach Indian children English and manual labor skills. Building off these recommendations, the provincial parliament in 1857 passed the Gradual Civilization Act, which intended to assimilate the Indians by removing all legal distinctions between them and the Crown's other Canadian subjects. It also intended to facilitate the acquisition of private property rights, and, most crucially, established a voluntary process whereby adult men could apply for enfranchisement, which, if granted, entailed the loss of Indian status. So just like in the US, Indians could become Canadians, but only if they no longer identified as Indian. This process of domesticating the Indians continued when, in 1867, the federal government of Canada was established. A series of legislation gave the Canadian government enormous powers over Indigenous peoples. The Indian Acts, for example, grants the government power to determine who qualifies for quote-unquote Indian status, discriminating especially against Indigenous women who married non-Indians, automatically stripping them of their Indian status. The Indian Acts also determine who has the right to live on reserves, how reserve lands are to be used, how reserves are supposed to be governed, and even how property is to be dispersed upon the death of an Indian. And in 1879, the Canadian Prime Minister commissioned an investigation into America's so-called peace policy, or what the author of the report, Nicholas Davin, said was a policy of, quote, aggressive civilization. The report gave unqualified support for the principle of the industrial boarding school model. Okay, and we're going to wrap up this week with a brief overview of Andrew Woolford's analytical framework called the settler-colonial mesh, which he uses to explain the uneven development of indigenous boarding schools in North America through a multi-level approach. By uneven development, he's trying to understand the different outcomes across space and time, as well as the uneven experiences of students. There are some students who enjoyed aspects of their schooling experience, and some are even able to appropriate boarding schools for their own purposes. A multi-level analysis, he says, has the potential to overcome the false dichotomy between agency and victimization. Accordingly, he imagines colonialism as a series of nets that operate to constrain agency, but are also prone to snags and openings that enable agentic resistance. Okay, so what are these multiple levels of analysis? In the first place, the macro level works at the widest and most general level of society. Here we find the dominant visions of the colonial order, or the ideological factors involved with the construction of the so-called Indian problem. At the meso level are the various institutions involved with settler colonial processes. So, obviously each individual school is an institution in this process, but there are other institutions involved as well, such as the role of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in administering the IRS system. Finally, at each institution are individual students, teachers, administrators, etc. This brings us down to the micro level. Indigenous actors involved at the lower levels of the settler-colonial mesh were sometimes able to negotiate their experiences to varying degrees. Again, that's the purpose of this theoretical model, to account for Indigenous agency within the structural confines of the settler-colonial assimilative project. Okay, and that's it. Usual assignments this week. plus your final paper. Reach out to me if you want help with sources. I'm also happy to look at drafts or outlines or whatever. Anyways, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.